The courtroom was dead silent, save for the distinct, mocking chuckle of Richard Vance. He adjusted his $3,000 suit, leaned back in his leather chair, and smirked at the jury. He thought he had already won. After all, he was the CEO of Vantage Tech, and his wife, Annie? She was just a quiet homemaker standing alone at the plaintiff's table, wearing a cardigan that looked 10 years old. No lawyer, no paralegal, just a stack of disorganized papers. Richard whispered to his high-powered attorney, "Watch this. She'll cry in 5 minutes." But he didn't know what was in those papers. He didn't know that for the last 12 years, Annie wasn't just raising his children. She was watching. And when she finally opened her mouth to speak, the laughter didn't just stop. It died. And the gasp that tore through the courtroom changed everything. The rain battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance estate, a modern fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Puget Sound. Inside, the temperature was always set to a crisp 68 degrees, just how Richard liked it. Annie Vance stood by the granite island in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she held the manila envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. She knew exactly what it was. "Don't look so tragic, Ellie," Richard said, walking into the kitchen while checking his emails on his phone. He didn't even look up at her. "It's standard procedure. Irreconcilable differences. I'm being generous, considering." Generous? Annie's voice was barely a whisper. She looked at the man she had been married to for 15 years, the man she had supported when he was fixing computers in a garage, the man she had nursed through pneumonia when they couldn't afford health insurance. "You're kicking me out of the house, Richard. You're asking for full custody of Leo and Sarah." Richard finally looked up, his eyes cold and blue, devoid of any warmth they might have once held. "I can provide for them. You have, what? A degree in library science you haven't used since 2008? No income. No residence. My lawyers advise that it's in the children's best interest to stay in the marital home, which is mine." "Ours," she corrected, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mine," Richard emphasized, grabbing a bottle of sparkling water. "I paid for the mortgage. I paid for the renovations. I paid for the clothes on your back. Let's be real, Annie. You were a great starter wife. You helped me get organized. But I need someone who fits the brand now. Someone who can stand next to me at galas without looking like they're afraid of the waiters." He was referring to Jessica Thorne, his new chief operating officer. Young, brilliant, and ruthless. Annie had seen the texts months ago. She hadn't said a word. She had just observed. "I'm not signing this," Annie said, placing the envelope on the counter. Richard laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "Then we go to court. And if we go to court, Annie, I will destroy you. I have Marcus Sterling on retainer. Do you know who he is?" Everyone in Seattle knew Marcus Sterling. He was the Viper of the Pacific Northwest. He didn't just win divorce cases. He incinerated the opposition. He cost $1,000 an hour and was worth every penny if you wanted to bury someone. "I know who he is," Annie said. "Good. Then you know you can't afford him. You can't afford anyone. I've frozen the joint accounts, Ellie, just until the settlement is reached, to prevent reckless spending. So unless you want to beg your parents— oh wait, you don't speak to them, you're out of luck." He took a sip of water, expecting her to crumble. That was Annie's pattern. She absorbed pain. She went quiet. She retreated. But today, Annie didn't retreat. She smoothed the front of her sweater. "I don't need money for a lawyer, Richard." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Did you find some pro bono charity case to take you on?" "No," Annie said, looking him dead in the eye for the first time in years. "I'm going to represent myself." For a second there was silence. Then Richard threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine belly laugh that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from his eye. "You," he wheezed. "You're going to go pro se against Marcus Sterling? Ellie, you get anxiety ordering a pizza over the phone. You stutter when you're nervous. This isn't a book club debate. This is superior court." "I know the truth, Richard," she said quietly. "The truth doesn't matter in court, darling." Richard sneered, grabbing his car keys. "The narrative matters. And the narrative is that I am a successful titan of industry, and you are an unstable, unemployed housewife who is bitter about being upgraded. Good luck, Ellie. You're gonna need it." He walked out, the heavy front door slamming shut behind him. Annie stood alone in the silence. She waited until she heard the roar of his Porsche fade down the driveway. Then she walked over to the pantry. She pushed aside a stack of heavy cookbooks and triggered a false panel in the back of the cabinet. Inside wasn't food. It was a stack of hard drives and 3 heavy leather-bound notebooks. He forgot. Annie whispered to the empty room. "He forgot that before I was a librarian. I was a forensic auditor." She pulled out the first notebook. It was time to go to work. Marcus Sterling's office smelled of mahogany and intimidation. He sat behind a desk that cost more than most cars, flipping through Annie's initial filing. Richard sat across from him, looking bored. "Can we wrap this up, Marcus? I have a board meeting at 2. "It's almost insultingly easy," Marcus said, his voice like gravel. She filed a pro se appearance. No counsel. She filled out the forms by hand. "Look at this." He tossed a document across the desk. "Her handwriting is neat, I'll give her that. But she's citing statutes from the 1990s. She's completely out of her depth." "She's stubborn," Richard said, checking his watch. "She thinks because she balanced our checkbook back in the day, she understands finance." "We're going to crush her on the motion for temporary support," Marcus said, lacing his fingers together. "I'm going to paint a picture of her, Richard. She's emotionally unstable, depressed, isolated. We have the medical records from her therapy sessions 3 years ago." "Got 'em," Richard nodded. "Postpartum stuff after Sarah. She had a rough time." "Perfect," Marcus smiled, a predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We argue she's mentally unfit to manage the estate or the children. We offer her a small stipend, enough to rent a studio apartment, and we take the kids. She'll crack within a week and sign the settlement." "I almost feel bad for her," Richard lied. "Almost." November 12th, 2023, a small motel room on Route 9. Annie had been forced out of the house 3 days prior. Richard's legal team had filed an emergency motion claiming her presence in the home was causing undue stress to the children, citing an argument which Richard had instigated as proof of her volatility. She was staying in the Starlight Motel. It was cheap, loud, and smelled of stale cigarettes. The small desk in the corner was covered in paper. But it wasn't chaotic. It was a timeline. Annie sat under the flickering fluorescent light, her glasses perched on her nose. She wasn't looking at divorce statutes anymore. She was looking at bank routing numbers. "Vantage Tech," she mumbled, tracing a line on a spreadsheet she had printed out at the public library. "Shell Company in the Caymans. Blue Horizon Consulting. Payments of $50,000 monthly for consulting fees." She cross-referenced it with Richard's travel itinerary from 2019 to 2023. Every time money went to Blue Horizon, Richard was supposedly on a business trip in Miami, but the flight logs she had accessed, using Richard's old password he hadn't changed in 10 years, didn't show Miami. They showed Grand Cayman. "You got sloppy, Richard," she whispered. But proving it was different than knowing it. She needed to get this into evidence without Marcus Sterling objecting it into oblivion. She needed to trap him. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her son, Leo, 14. "Dad says her crazy. Says her trying to steal his money. Is it true?" Annie's heart broke. This was the hardest part. The alienation. Richard was poisoning the kids against her. She typed back, "I love you, Leo. The truth will come out. Just be patient. Mom loves you." She put the phone down and picked up a highlighter. She had one shot at this. If she failed, she lost her kids forever. If she won, she took down a giant. She turned the page of the notebook. It was titled, Operation Glass House. The courtroom was packed. Divorce cases didn't usually draw a crowd, but Richard Vance was a local celebrity, and the rumor that his wife was representing herself had circulated through the legal community like wildfire. Law students were in the back, taking notes. Reporters from the Seattle Times were present. Judge Anthony Thorne presided. He was an older man, known for his impatience with incompetence. He peered over his spectacles at the defense table. "Mr. Sterling." Judge Thorne nodded. "Good morning, Your Honor," Marcus Sterling boomed, standing tall and confident. "And—" Judge Thorne looked at the plaintiff's table, where Annie sat alone. She looked small. She wore a simple gray suit she had bought at a thrift store. "Mrs. Vance, you are appearing pro se. I must advise you, as I do all litigants, that this is highly inadvisable. Mr. Sterling is a veteran attorney. You will be held to the same standards of evidence and procedure as he is. Are you sure you wish to proceed?" Annie stood up. Her knees were shaking, but she gripped the table to steady herself. "Yes, Your Honor. I cannot afford counsel, as my husband has frozen our assets, and I do not wish to delay these proceedings." Richard snorted from the defense table. Sterling elbowed him to be quiet. "Very well," Judge Thorne sighed. "Opening statements, Mr. Sterling." Marcus Sterling walked to the center of the room. He didn't use notes. He was a storyteller. "Your Honor, this is a sad case," Sterling began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "It is a case about a man, Richard Vance, who has built an empire to support his family. A man who works 80 hours a week. And it is about a woman who unfortunately has lost her way." He gestured to Annie. "The evidence will show that Mrs. Vance has become increasingly erratic, paranoid, and vindictive. Jealous of her husband's success, she has launched this crusade to humiliate him. She is asking for half of Vantage Tech, half of a company she never worked for. She is asking for full custody despite having no income and a history of depressive episodes. We are here to protect the children, Your Honor, and to ensure that Mr. Vance's life's work is not dismantled by greed." He sat down. Richard patted him on the back. It was a strong opening. It painted Annie as the villain. "Mrs. Vance," the judge asked. Annie stood up again. She walked to the podium. She didn't look at the judge. She turned and looked directly at Richard. The room went quiet. "I don't have a speech prepared," Annie said, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Sterling is very good with words. He calls me greedy. He calls me unstable." She paused, looking down at a single piece of paper. "I am not here for half of Vantage Tech, Your Honor. I don't want his company. I am here to prove that the company Mr. Sterling is protecting doesn't actually exist. At least, not the way the IRS thinks it does." Marcus Sterling's head snapped up. Richard froze. "Objection!" Sterling shouted, standing up. "Relevance! This is a divorce hearing, not a corporate audit." "It goes to the division of assets, Your Honor," Annie said calmly, turning to the judge. "If the marital assets are built on fraud, the court needs to know." Judge Thorne narrowed his eyes. He looked at Richard, who was suddenly very pale. "I'll allow it," Judge Thorne said, "but tread carefully, Mrs. Vance. If you are making accusations of criminal conduct, you better have the receipts." "I have the receipts, Your Honor," Annie said. "I have 12 years of them." She sat down. Richard leaned over to Sterling, whispering aggressively, "She's bluffing. She doesn't know anything. She's just a housewife." "She better be," Sterling hissed back, "because if she's not, we have a problem." The first 2 days of the trial were a bloodbath. Sterling called expert witnesses to testify about Annie's fragile mental state. He brought up the time she crashed her car in 2018, a minor fender bender on ice. He brought up the time she missed a PTA meeting. Then he put Annie on the stand. "Mrs. Vance," Sterling prowled around the witness box. "Is it true that in 2021 you spent $3,000 on online courses?" "Yes," Annie said. "What were those courses for? Cooking? Gardening?" "Continuing education," she said. "For what?" Sterling pressed, smiling mockingly. "You haven't held a job in 15 years. Were you planning to leave your husband back then? Were you using his money to prepare your escape?" "I was keeping my mind sharp," Annie said. "By studying? What exactly?" "Forensic accounting and digital asset tracing," Annie answered. A few jurors raised their eyebrows. Sterling paused, slightly thrown, but he recovered quickly. "A hobby, then? Like knitting?" Tell me, Mrs. Vance, did you ever balance the books for Vantage Tech? No, Annie said. Richard wouldn't let me near them. Exactly, Sterling triumphantly turned to the jury. Because you were not qualified. You were the domestic partner. Richard made the money, you spent it. And now you want to ruin him because he found happiness elsewhere. Isn't that right? I want what is fair, Annie said. Fair? Sterling laughed. You live in a motel. You have no job. You are dragging your children through a public spectacle. Is that what a good mother does? Annie gripped the railing of the witness box. Her knuckles were white. A good mother protects her children from a father who lies. Objection, Sterling shouted. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Thorne said. Sterling leaned in close to her face. You're drowning, Annie. Everyone in this room can see it. Why don't you just give up? Annie looked at him. For a split second, a flicker of a smile crossed her face. I'm just waiting for my turn, Mr. Sterling. Sterling ended his questioning, looking smug. He felt he had discredited her completely. The jury looked sympathetic but skeptical of her ability to parent. Richard looked delighted. He gave Annie a thumbs up as she walked back to her table. A cruel, childish gesture. Annie sat down and wrote one word on her notepad. Bait. She had let them attack her character for 2 days. She had let them think she was defensive. She had let them think the only thing she had was bitterness. Now it was time for the plaintiff's case. Mrs. Vance. Judge Thorne said on the morning of the 3rd day, call your first witness. Annie stood up. She picked up the heavy binder she had been guarding. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Richard Vance to the stand. The courtroom murmured. Putting the defendant on the stand as a hostile witness was risky, especially when the defendant was as charismatic as Richard. Richard buttoned his jacket, winked at his lawyer, and strode to the stand. He looked like he was about to accept an award. Annie walked to the podium. She didn't look at her notes. Mr. Vance, she began, you stated in your financial affidavit that your net worth is $12 million. Is that correct? Give or take, Richard smiled. Market fluctuates. And you stated that Vantage Tech has no offshore holdings, subsidiaries, or satellite offices outside of Washington State, correct? Correct, Richard said, looking bored. We are an American company. Annie walked over to her table and picked up a document. Your Honor, I'd like to mark this as Exhibit A. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who handed it to Richard. Mr. Vance, do you recognize this signature? Richard glanced at it. It looks like my signature, but it's a photocopy. Could be forged. It's a catastrophic insurance policy, Annie said, for a property located at 44 Cayman Way, Georgetown, Grand Cayman. The policy is in the name of Richard Vance. Why would you insure a property you don't own? Richard stiffened. Sterling sat up straighter. I might have looked into buying a vacation home years ago, Richard stammered. I never went through with it. The policy is dated last month, Annie said. Objection! Sterling stood up. Ambush! We haven't seen this document. It was in the discovery box you sent me, Annie said calmly. It was mixed in with the kids' medical records. Page 4002. Did you not read your own discovery production, Mr. Sterling? The courtroom gasped. Sterling turned red. He had drowned her in paper, hoping she wouldn't read it. He hadn't realized his paralegal had accidentally included a personal file. Richard looked at Sterling for help. Answer the question, Mr. Vance, Judge Thorne said, leaning forward. It's a rental, Richard blurted out. I rented it for a vacation. For a vacation, Annie repeated. Okay, let's talk about how you paid for this rental. She went back to her table. This was it. The trap was set. Mr. Vance, who is Jessica Thorne? Richard's eyes darted to the back of the room where Jessica was sitting. She looked terrified. She is my COO. And my partner. Your romantic partner? Yes, Richard said defiantly. We are in love, unlike us. I see, Annie said. And as COO, does Miss Thorne have access to the company accounts? Yes. Does she have access to the account ending in 8,890 at Swiss Fidelity Bank? The silence in the room was deafening. Richard stopped breathing. I don't know what account that is, Richard lied. Annie smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile. That's strange, Richard. Because I have a recording of you calling that bank on September 12th. You were on speakerphone in the kitchen. You thought I was in the garden. I wasn't. She held up a small USB drive. Your Honor, I would like to play Exhibit B. Richard Vance wasn't laughing anymore. The courtroom air was so thick with tension you could choke on it. Judge Thorne looked at the USB drive in Annie's hand, then at Richard Vance, whose face had gone from pale to a mottled, angry red. Mr. Sterling, Judge Thorne said, his voice dangerously low, did you know about the existence of this recording? I most certainly did not, Your Honor, Sterling said, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He looked at his client with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Rule number 1 of defense. Never lie to your own lawyer. Play it, Judge Thorne ordered. Annie handed the drive to the court clerk. A moment later, Richard's voice, arrogant, unmistakable and booming, filled the silent room. Audio recording. I don't care what the audit says, Dave. Just move the funds to the Swiss account. Call it R&D expenses. Annie is too stupid to notice. She's busy clipping coupons while I'm moving millions. If she ever tries to leave, I'll bury her. I'll make sure she doesn't get a dime. I've got the house leveraged, the accounts drained. She'll be homeless in a month. There was a pause on the tape, followed by another voice, Jessica Thorne. Richard, isn't that illegal? If the IRS catches... Richard, the IRS is understaffed and overworked. And Annie? She's a librarian. She thinks an asset is a first edition book. By the time the divorce is finalized, Vantage Tech will look like it's bankrupt on paper. I'll buy it back through the shell company once she's out on the street. The recording ended with the click of a phone hanging up. The silence that followed was absolute. Annie stood frozen. Hearing it out loud, in public, hurt more than she expected. She's too stupid to notice. That was what he really thought of her. Judge Thorne slowly took off his glasses. He looked at Richard Vance with pure disgust. Mr. Vance, the judge said, did you just admit to bankruptcy fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud your spouse on a recording? Richard stood up, knocking his chair over. That's private. That was a private conversation. She had no right to record me in my own home. It's inadmissible. Actually, Annie spoke up, her voice cutting through his shouting. Washington is a two-party consent state for audio recording. That is true. However, there is an exception for recordings made capturing evidence of a felony involving violence or severe financial crimes threatening the livelihood of a dependent. Furthermore, you weren't in a private room. You were on the back patio. I was recording my son's soccer practice in the yard. You shouted loud enough to be picked up by the camera. There is no expectation of privacy when you are screaming your crimes to the neighborhood. She turned to the judge. I have the video file to corroborate the audio timestamps. Marcus Sterling closed his laptop. He didn't even look at Richard. He stood up. Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice flat, I would like to request a recess. I need to confer with my client regarding his testimony. Denied, Judge Thorne snapped. Sit down, Mr. Sterling. You can yell at your client later. Right now, Mrs. Vance is cross-examining him. Continue, Mrs. Vance. Annie looked at Richard. He was cornered. A cornered animal is dangerous, but Annie held the whip. Mr. Vance, she said, the recording mentions Dave. Is that David Miller, your chief financial officer? I take the fifth, Richard spat. This isn't a criminal trial yet, Mr. Vance, the judge warned, though it might be soon. In civil court, taking the fifth allows the jury to draw a negative inference. That means if you don't answer, we assume the answer is the worst possible one for you. Richard clenched his jaw. Yes, David Miller. And Jessica Thorne knew about this scheme? Annie asked, gesturing to the back of the room. Richard hesitated. He looked at Jessica. If he implicated her, he lost his only ally. If he didn't, he took the fall alone. No, Richard lied. She didn't understand what we were doing. Really? Annie picked up another document. Because I have emails here between you and Miss Thorne discussing how to structure the consulting fees to Blue Horizon to avoid detection. Would you like me to read those? Richard slumped into his chair. He looked small. The titan of industry was gone. All that was left was a liar in a suit. No further questions, Annie said. The rain had stopped in Seattle, leaving behind a gray, heavy sky that seemed to press against the windows of courtroom 4B. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air conditioner hummed, but it did little to cool the heat radiating from the defense table. Richard Vance sat rigidly, his expensive suit now looking like a costume he was tired of wearing. He drummed his fingers on the mahogany table, a nervous tic he hadn't displayed since the early days of Vantage Tech when payroll was late. Beside him, Marcus Sterling was furiously scribbling notes, his brow furrowed. The viper of the legal world had been defanged, and he knew it. Annie stood at the plaintiff's table. She arranged her papers with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a final incision. She didn't look triumphant. She looked focused. She knew that wounding a beast wasn't enough. You had to finish it, or it would come back to kill you. Mrs. Vance, Judge Thorne's voice boomed from the bench, cutting through the murmurs of the gallery. Call your next witness. Annie smoothed the front of her skirt. She took a breath, centering herself. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady and echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. The plaintiff calls Jessica Thorne to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The press reporters in the back row leaned forward, pens hovering over notepads. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The wife versus the mistress. The past versus the future. Jessica Thorne stood up from the back bench. She was stunning, undeniable in her beauty. She wore a tailored cream blazer and a pencil skirt that probably cost more than Annie's car. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, perfect bun. But as she walked down the aisle, the click-clack of her heels on the linoleum sounded less like a power march and more like a countdown. She avoided looking at Annie. She avoided looking at the judge. Her eyes locked briefly with Richard's. Richard gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a silent command, stick to the script. Jessica took the stand. The bailiff swore her in. She sat down, crossing her legs elegantly, but Annie noticed the way her fingers gripped the armrest until the skin turned white. Miss Thorne, Annie began, standing behind her podium. She didn't approach the witness box yet. She wanted the distance. Please state your full name and occupation for the court. Jessica Marie Thorne, she said, her voice crisp but tight. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Vantage Tech. And how long have you held that position? 3 years. And before that, Annie asked. I was the Vice President of Marketing, Jessica replied. A rapid assent. Annie noted dryly. Miss Thorne, are you currently in a relationship with the defendant Richard Vance? Marcus Sterling stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. We have already established the grounds for dissolution of marriage. This is just an attempt to embarrass the witness. It goes to credibility and bias, Your Honor. Annie countered calmly without looking at Sterling. Ms. Thorne is a hostile witness with a vested interest in the outcome of this financial division. Overruled, Judge Thorne said, leaning back. Answer the question, Miss Thorne. Jessica stiffened. Yes, we are together. Is it serious? Annie asked. Yes, Jessica said, lifting her chin defiantly. We intend to marry once this process is concluded. I see, Annie said. She walked over to her table and picked up a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a bank statement this time. It was an email printout. So you trust Mr. Vance? You believe he has your best interests at heart? Of course, Jessica scoffed. Richard is a visionary. He takes care of the people who are loyal to him. Loyalty, Annie repeated the word, tasting it. That's a funny thing, loyalty. It usually requires reciprocity. She walked toward the witness stand, holding the paper against her chest, hiding the text. Miss Thorne, are you aware of a limited liability company called Orion Ventures? Jessica blinked. The confidence cracked. Just a hairline fracture. I think I've heard the name. It's a shell company for potential acquisitions. It was formed 3 weeks ago, Annie said. Do you know who the registered agent is? No. It's Richard Vance, Annie said. She handed the paper to the bailiff to pass to Jessica. And do you recognize this email thread, marked Exhibit D? Jessica took the paper. Her eyes scanned the text. Her breath hitched in her throat. "Read the highlighted section for the court, please," Annie requested softly. Jessica's hands began to tremble. She looked at Richard. Richard's face had drained of all color. He started shaking his head violently, mouthing the word "stop." "Miss Thorne?" Judge Thorne pressed. Jessica's voice shook as she read. It's an email from Richard to a headhunter in New York, dated November 14th. "Please read the text," Annie insisted. Jessica swallowed hard, fighting back tears that were suddenly threatening to ruin her perfect makeup. "I need a new COO in place by January 1st. The current one is becoming a liability. Too much baggage. Once the divorce settles, I'm cutting ties. Find me someone younger, cheaper, and with fewer strings attached. Also, look into condos in Miami, single occupancy." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that had just landed but hadn't detonated yet. Jessica lowered the paper. She looked at Richard. The look wasn't love anymore. It was pure, unadulterated horror. "He was going to fire you," Annie said, her voice filled not with malice but with a strange, sad empathy. "He was going to use you to help him hide the money, destroy me, and then he was going to discard you just like he discarded me. You aren't the future Mrs. Vance, Jessica. You're just the getaway driver." "Objection!" Sterling roared, desperate to stop the bleeding. "Argumentative! She is badgering the witness." "I'm not badgering her," Annie said, turning to the judge. "I'm saving her." Annie turned back to Jessica. "Miss Thorne, look at me." Jessica looked. For the first time, she really looked at Annie. She didn't see a frumpy housewife. She saw a woman who had survived the man Jessica was currently protecting. "I have submitted my forensic audit to the court," Annie said. "The fraud is undeniable. The IRS is coming. The SEC is coming. Richard is going down. The only question left is, are you going down with him?" Annie leaned in, her hands on the railing of the witness box. "If you lie for him today, you commit perjury. You become an accessory to felony fraud. You will go to federal prison. And for what? For a man who is already interviewing your replacement?" Tears streamed down Jessica's face. The porcelain doll had shattered. "Ms. Thorne," Judge Thorne said gently, "I need to remind you that you are under oath. And I need to remind you that the penalties for perjury are severe." Jessica looked at Richard one last time. He was glaring at her, his eyes filled with a menacing promise of retribution. But he had no power here, not anymore. Jessica took a deep, shuddering breath. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. She sat up straight. "He made me do it," she whispered. "Speak up, Miss Thorne," the judge ordered. "He made me do it!" Jessica shouted, her voice breaking. She pointed a shaking finger at Richard. "He told me that if I didn't help him hide the assets, he would fire me and blacklist me from the industry. He said Annie was too stupid to figure it out. He said we had to starve the beast, so she would settle for pennies." "You lie!" Richard jumped up, knocking his heavy oak chair backward with a deafening crash. "You ungrateful little—" "Sit down, Mr. Vance." The bailiff moved toward him, hand on his taser. "He set up the accounts in the Caymans." Jessica continued, the words pouring out of her like a dam breaking. She wasn't looking at Richard anymore. She was looking at the jury, begging for salvation. Blue Horizon, dark pools, crypto wallets. I have the keys. I have the ledgers. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the IRS and one for himself. He told me to shred the invoices from the contractors who built the lake house. He claimed it was a corporate retreat center to write it off. "Did he involve anyone else?" Annie asked, keeping the momentum. "David Miller, the CFO," Jessica sobbed. And he forged your signature, Annie." "On the loan documents for the expansion. He practiced it for weeks. He laughed about it. He said you were better worth to him as a signature than a wife." The jury looked horrified. One juror, an older woman in the front row, looked at Richard with open disgust. Richard was red-faced, veins bulging in his neck. He leaned over to Marcus Sterling. "Do something! Shut her up!" Sterling closed his laptop. He stacked his papers. He looked at Richard with the cold detachment of a professional who realizes the check is going to bounce. "There is nothing to do, Richard. You're done." "Miss Thorne," Annie said softly, "thank you, that took courage." "I don't want to go to jail," Jessica wept, putting her head in her hands. "I just did what he told me." "No further questions," Annie said. She walked back to her table and sat down. She felt a trembling in her own hands now. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline crash. She had just dismantled her husband's life, using the very weapon he had sharpened against her. Judge Thorne stared at Richard Vance for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice like grinding stones. "Do you have any cross-examination for this witness?" Sterling stood up slowly. He looked at Jessica, who was a mess of tears and ruined makeup, and then at Richard, who was breathing heavily, looking like a trapped rat. "No, Your Honor," Sterling said quietly. "The defense has no questions." "Then the witness is excused," Judge Thorne said. "Miss Thorne, do not leave the jurisdiction. I suspect the district attorney will want to speak with you within the hour." Jessica stumbled down from the stand. She didn't go back to the seat behind Richard. She walked straight out the back doors of the courtroom, her heels clicking rapidly, running away from the wreckage she had helped create. The room was silent, save for the hum of the ventilation and the sound of Richard Vance's heavy breathing. "Does the plaintiff rest?" Judge Thorne asked. Annie stood up one last time. She looked at Richard. He wasn't the giant he had been 3 days ago. He wasn't the genius CEO. He was just a liar who had been caught. "Yes, Your Honor," Annie said clearly. "The plaintiff rests." Richard put his head in his hands. For the first time in the entire trial, he finally understood the gravity of his mistake. He hadn't just underestimated Annie. He had never really known her at all. And now, she was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell. And he knew, with a sinking dread, that she was done negotiating. The silence that filled courtroom 4B after Jessica Thorne fled was not empty. It was heavy, pressing down on the shoulders of every person in the room. The air tasted of stale coffee and impending doom. Richard Vance sat slumped in his chair. The confident posture of the titan of industry was gone. His tie was loosened, his hair, usually lacquered into perfect submission, was disheveled where he had run his hands through it repeatedly. He stared at the polished wood of the defense table as if looking for a trap door to open and swallow him whole. Marcus Sterling, the Viper, looked less like a high-powered attorney and more like a man calculating his own liability insurance. He stacked his papers slowly, delaying the inevitable. There was no strategy left. The chessboard had been flipped, the pieces scattered, and his king was cornered. "Counsel," Judge Thorne said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Closing arguments. Mr. Sterling, you have the floor." Sterling stood up. He didn't button his jacket this time. He walked to the center of the room, but his stride lacked its usual predatory grace. He looked at the jury, then at the judge, and finally, briefly, at his client. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Sterling began, his voice smooth but weary. "We have heard a lot of emotion over the last few days. We have heard accusations, outbursts, and a narrative painted by a woman scorned." He gestured vaguely toward Annie. "But we are in a court of law, not a court of feelings. My client, Richard Vance, is a builder. He built Vantage Tech from a garage into a global empire. Yes, he is a man of complicated finances. Yes, he is a man who, under the immense pressure of sustaining 1,000 employees, may have made administrative errors. He may have moved funds to protect the company's liquidity during a volatile market. That is not malice. That is business." Sterling walked along the jury box, trying to make eye contact, but the jurors looked away. "Mrs. Vance is asking you to destroy a man because the marriage failed. She is asking for the keys to a kingdom she did not build. She speaks of fraud, but where is the intent to harm? Mr. Vance was trying to preserve the estate for his children. If you strip him of his assets, if you cripple his company, based on the testimony of a disgruntled employee like Miss Thorne. You are not serving justice. You are serving revenge. We ask that you look past the theatrics and award a fair, standard division of assets, keeping the business intact under the stewardship of the man who created it." Sterling sat down. It was a weak speech, a desperate attempt to reframe criminal fraud as, quote, "administrative errors," and everyone knew it. "Mrs. Vance," the judge said. Annie stood up. She didn't pick up her notes. She didn't need them. She had lived this speech for 12 years. She walked to the center of the room, standing in the exact spot Sterling had just vacated. She wore her simple gray cardigan, a stark contrast to the sea of black suits around her. "When I filed for divorce," Annie began, her voice soft but carrying to the back of the room, "my husband laughed at me." She turned to look at Richard. He refused to meet her eyes. He laughed because he believed that power is defined by who signs the checks. He believed that because I was a stay-at-home mother, because I was just a housewife, I was blind. He thought that my silence was submission. He thought my kindness was stupidity. Annie turned to the jury. She saw the older woman in the front row nodding slightly. "Mr. Sterling talks about building. He says Richard built this empire alone. But who managed the home while he worked 80-hour weeks? Who raised his children? Who managed the contractors, the accountants, the social calendar, and the life that allowed him to be the CEO? I did. Marriage is a partnership. It is a contract. And in that contract, I held up my end. I gave him my youth, my energy, and my loyalty." She took a step closer to the defense table. "But Richard Vance broke that contract long before he filed for divorce. He didn't just cheat on me with another woman. He cheated on our children. Every dollar he hid in the Cayman Islands was a dollar stolen from his daughter's college fund. Every forged signature was a betrayal of the trust that is the foundation of a family. He didn't hide money to preserve the estate. He hid it to starve us out. He wanted to leave the mother of his children destitute, just to prove he could." Annie's voice grew stronger, vibrating with a controlled, righteous anger that captivated the room. "We tell our children to tell the truth. We tell them that cheaters never prosper. If Richard Vance walks out of this courtroom with his company intact, we are telling a lie. We are saying that if you are rich enough and loud enough, the rules don't apply to you. I am not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I am asking for the one thing my husband never gave me." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Respect. I am asking for the respect of a fair judgment. I am asking you to see me, not as a victim, but as the rightful partner who is owed her share." Annie walked back to her table and sat down. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It felt like the calm before a righteous storm. Judge Thorne didn't ask for a recess. He didn't retreat to his chambers to deliberate. He had seen the evidence. He had heard the tapes. He had watched the mistress confess. The facts were not in dispute. He adjusted his glasses and looked over the rim at Richard Vance. "Please rise," the bailiff announced. Richard stood up, his legs shaky. Annie stood, her head high. "In my 25 years on the bench," Judge Thorne said, his tone conversational yet terrifying, "I have presided over thousands of divorce cases. I have seen bitterness. I have seen greed. I have seen heartbreak. But, Mr. Vance, I have rarely seen such a calculated, systematic, and arrogant attempt to defraud this court." Richard flinched as if he had been struck. "You treated these proceedings as a game," the judge continued, his voice rising. "You treated your wife as an adversary to be crushed rather than a partner to be equitable with. You hid assets. You forged documents. You intimidated witnesses. You suborned perjury from Miss Thorne. You believed that you were smarter than the law." The judge leaned forward. "You were wrong. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Annie Vance, on all counts," Judge Thorne declared. Regarding the division of assets, the judge read from his notes. Due to the defendant's egregious financial misconduct and concealment of marital funds, I am invoking the unclean hands doctrine. I am deviating from the standard 50-50 split. Sterling closed his eyes. He knew what was coming. I am awarding Mrs. Vance 75% of the total marital estate. The judge ruled. This includes the family home in Seattle, the vacation property in Aspen, and the entirety of the liquid assets currently held in the joint accounts. Richard gasped. 75%? That's everything. Silence, Judge Thorne snapped. I am not finished regarding Vantage Tech. The court finds that the company was used as a vehicle for fraud. However, dismantling it would harm innocent employees. Therefore, I am ordering that 49% of the voting stock of Vantage Tech be transferred immediately to Annie Vance. Furthermore, I am placing the remaining 51%, your share, Mr. Vance, into a court-controlled trust. You are hereby removed as CEO, effective immediately, pending an independent audit. Richard grabbed the table for support. You can't do that. It's my company. I built it. You used it to commit crimes, Judge Thorne said coldly. You don't get to keep the weapon you used to mug your wife. Regarding custody, the judge softened his tone as he looked at Annie. Full legal and physical custody is awarded to Mrs. Vance. Mr. Vance, your visitation is suspended indefinitely until you complete a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation and anger management course. And, frankly, considering what I am about to do next, visitation schedules may be the least of your worries. Judge Thorne picked up a thick manila envelope from his bench. The testimony given in this court over the last 3 days paints a clear picture of tax evasion, wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and conspiracy. I am unsealing the evidence presented by Mrs. Vance, specifically the forensic audit and the audio recordings. He looked at the bailiff. Is the representative from the district attorney's office present? A woman in a sharp navy suit stood up from the back row. Yes, Your Honor. And the representative from the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS? A man in a gray suit stood up next to her. Present, Your Honor. The court transfers all evidence to your custody, Judge Thorne said. Mr. Vance, do not leave this building. You are currently remanded into the custody of the King County Sheriff's Department, pending charges. The judge banged his gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Court is adjourned. Pandemonium erupted. Reporters shouted questions, their flashes popping like strobe lights. Richard Vance stood frozen, his mouth open, watching his life disintegrate in real time. 2 uniformed deputies walked up to the defense table. They didn't ask nicely. Mr. Vance, one deputy said, pulling Richard's arms behind his back. Turn around, please. This is a mistake. Richard stammered, panic finally setting in as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Marcus, do something. Call the governor. Marcus Sterling was already packing his briefcase. He looked at Richard with a flat, emotionless expression. I'm a divorce lawyer, Richard. You need a criminal defense attorney, and considering I haven't been paid in 3 months, good luck finding one. Sterling walked away, leaving Richard alone with the police. Annie stood at her table, packing her tote bag. She moved slowly, deliberately. She placed the forensic audit, the notebook that had started it all, back into her bag. As the deputies began to march Richard toward the side exit, they had to pass the plaintiff's table. Richard stopped. He looked at Annie. He looked older, smaller, and infinitely pathetic. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrified confusion. Ellie, he croaked, his voice cracking. Ellie, please. The kids. Don't let them see me like this. Help me. Annie stopped. She looked at the man she had loved for 15 years. She looked at the handcuffs. She looked at the expensive suit that now looked ridiculous on a man heading to a holding cell. She felt a pang of sadness, but it was the sadness one feels for a stranger in a tragedy. She stepped closer to him. The deputies paused, allowing the moment. I tried to help you, Richard, Annie said, her voice barely a whisper, intimate and devastating. For years. I tried to tell you that money wasn't everything. I tried to tell you that we were enough. But you didn't listen. I can fix it, Richard pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. We can fix this. Just tell the judge it was a misunderstanding." Annie smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was a smile of finality. "Do you remember the day you served me the papers?" she asked. "You told me I was a bad investment. You told me I had no value." Richard looked down, shame burning his face. "You were wrong," Annie said. "I was the only asset you had that was real." "And you liquidated me." She leaned in closer so only he could hear the final blow. "By the way," she whispered, "you should have checked the pantry. Behind the pasta jars. That's where I kept the real books. You were so busy looking at yourself in the mirror, you never once looked at what I was doing in the kitchen." She pulled back and nodded to the deputies. "He's all yours." The deputies shoved Richard forward. "Let's go, Vance." "Ellie!" he screamed one last time as they dragged him through the side door. "Annie!" The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. Annie stood alone in the center of the courtroom. The flashbulbs were still popping, reporters were shouting her name, asking for a statement. "Mrs. Vance! How did you know? Mrs. Vance, how do you feel?" She didn't answer them. She adjusted her cardigan, picked up her bag, and walked toward the main exit. She pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the hallway. Through the windows, the sun was finally breaking through the gray Seattle clouds. The rain had stopped. She took a deep breath. The air didn't smell like stale coffee anymore. It smelled like rain-washed pavement and fresh pine. She pulled her phone out of her pocket. There was a text message from Leo. "Is it over?" Annie typed back, "Yes, we're going home." She walked out of the courthouse, not as a victim, not as a wife, but as Annie Vance, CEO, mother, and the woman who didn't just survive the storm, but became it. 6 months later, the sun was setting over the Puget Sound, casting a golden glow over the Victorian porch where Annie sat. The old Vance estate, the glass fortress, had been sold to a tech bro from California. Annie didn't miss it. This house was warm. It had creaky floorboards and a garden that was slightly overgrown with hydrangeas. It was real. Inside, she could hear Leo and Sarah arguing over what movie to watch, but it was good-natured bickering, accompanied by the sound of popcorn popping. They were healing. It was a slow process, but the shadow of their father's toxicity was fading with every passing week. Annie took a sip of her tea and looked down at the tablet on her lap. The news article was open. Former tech mogul Richard Vance sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, assets seized. She scrolled down. There was a picture of Richard being led into the federal penitentiary. He looked gaunt. He looked old. She felt a vibration on the table. Her phone. A call from an unknown number. She picked it up. Annie Vance speaking. "Mrs. Vance?" A male voice, hesitant. "My name is John Gathers. I read about your case. My wife is doing the same thing to me. She's hiding assets in a shell company in Nevada. My lawyer says he can't find them. I was told you might be able to help." Annie smiled. She looked at the brass plaque she had just screwed into the wall next to her front door that morning. "I think I can help you, Mr. Gathers," Annie said, her voice strong and assured. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." She opened her notebook, a new one, leather-bound and crisp. She uncapped her pen. The story of Richard Vance was over. The story of Annie Vance was just beginning. And that is the incredible story of Annie Vance. She proved that the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one shouting. It's the one taking notes. Richard Vance thought he could discard his wife like an old receipt, but he forgot that she was the one balancing the books. In the end, his arrogance was his prison, and her intelligence was the key that locked him away. If this story of absolute justice gave you chills, please smash that like button. It helps the algorithm share this story with more people who need to see the underdog win. And if you want more stories about karma, revenge, and satisfying courtroom takedowns, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. What would you have done if you found those hidden books? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.